thing that we have a full house tonight for our Frontiers of Science lecture. I am now the first thing we're going to do tonight is invite the president of the Sister Science Club to make a brief announcement, and we'll wedge him out in the back. Please welcome David Durham.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming. Let's start with a joke here. What bird works at a construction site? A crane. Okay. Tonight, I just want to say a few words. We're going to be holding a fundraiser later this year, so we'd just like you to take note of that right now. You've seen a lot of pictures about the type of activities that the Science Club has been involved with, sponsored, etc. And we would like to continue that in the community. So your support is necessary and much appreciated. So that's all I'm asking for you. Now I'll let Rob take over.
All right. I think we're applauding brevity tonight. So while we're we always start with gratitude, and definitely the first group that I'd like to thank on behalf of our audience. I'm not a member of the board, but there are 7, I think, volunteers in our community who are, and David is one of them. Let's give him a round of applause at the end. I'd like to also thank Don Utzinger, who's probably up top. Don is the Vice President and Treasurer of the Sister Science Club. And he's also been our videographer lately, and we'll mention that more in a second. Gail Todd, Gail, could you raise your hand? We're going to take a look, because we're going to identify her to do a couple things, and she keeps the wheels on the tracks in so many ways. David Johnson, I haven't seen him tonight, but he's our resident veterinarian. Dr. Larry Price, I can see in the back, was our featured speaker in October, and along with David Ellis and Joe Sherry, those 3 have been our speakers bureau lately, lining up the speakers, doing a lot of the selection committee, if you will, and including tonight's speaker, which is wonderful. I'd also like to thank, although I know she is not here, in absentia, Jocelyn Blevins is the STEM teacher at our beautiful new elementary school. And she has been doing STEM, incredible work at the elementary level in STEM in the community for a number of years now. And on February 27th, not April 27th, so in other words, 4 weeks and 2 days from tonight, we'll be hosting the annual STEM night at the elementary school. How many of you have ever been to STEM night at the elementary school? That's great, and I think if you talk to anybody with their hand up, you'll know it is a really surprisingly fun, high-energy event with a lot of exhibitors from all kinds of different types of science in the area. A lot of families, obviously, little kids, young scientists running around. It takes a lot of volunteers to put that on. So if you're interested in getting inside our beautiful new elementary school, maybe helping out as a volunteer on behalf of the Science Club, I would direct you to Gail Todd with the table right near the door you came in. We could use the help, and you would have a lot of fun. The other thing that Jocelyn would want us to let you all know is that in addition, if you're here, you probably have something you can contribute somewhere in our schools in the area of science. It might be, with younger kids at the elementary school. It might be with older kids if that's your technical background, but I think Jocelyn loves helping people from the community find the right time and place in whatever the grade level, whatever the area of expertise is, to get you in front of students in the schools. So again, Gail will take down your name and number if you think that's something you might be interested in. Last round of thanks, then I'm going to ask, there's 2 of the board members, Jocelyn and also Joe Sherry in the back. Thank you so much for putting together the new website, which is up and online. If you take a look, it is www.sisterscienceclub.org, and you can either memorize that or just do a search on Sister Science Club and you'll get there. You can get updates on these lectures, and in fact, you can see, thanks to Don Utzinger's work, you can see if there's something you want to look at again in tonight's lecture. Don is posting the lectures after they occur, so you can, if you miss one, and then other things, if you have an idea for a lecture that you'd like to propose, there's a way to do that there. And maybe even make a donation to the 501c3 that is the Science Club. So how about that's all stuff that the board is doing. Thank you very much to our board members. A little more by way of gratitude, and as always, I think we have to thank our impresaria, Angeline, who's standing next to the soundboard. Amazing cultural facility that's not only Science Club, but it's music and arts, and thank you, Angeline, you had a lot to our town. Carol Moorhead and Ann Richardson greeted people at the door, and we're taking donations, thanks to them. Rod Moorhead and possibly Dan Oliver helped set up chairs tonight. Thank you for those guys. Dan is one of our teachers at the high school. And then Peyton Myrie's running AV, or you wouldn't be hearing me right now. So thanks to all the people that helped put that on tonight. And, for fans of science in Sisters, Oregon, there's one more kind of special thing that happened since we were all together, and I think it's a big thank you that we're going to all owe. Sisters is now officially certified as an international dark sky community college. Cities in the state that have that. Most are far more rural than we are. And in particular, I know a lot of people were involved. The City of Sisters, the Explore Sisters group, I think did a lot of the paperwork from what I understand and those sorts of things. And City of Sisters actually passed ordinances that are now in effect. In addition, there's some things in the county level, but so there's a lot of groups that we could ask, but I think there's one person and one group who I think are represented here tonight, our own Sisters High School graduate and current high school teacher, Rima Gibbett, and the other members of the Astronomy Club who've been working on this for like 20 years. So thank you very much. Along the way, Rima does a lot to mentor students and create a good environment for all of us to enjoy the night skies, stars, planets, comets, whatever else happens, auroras on occasion, like that. So thanks for the hand for them. And as long as I'm standing up here talking about dark skies, please redirect your lights at home. Please turn them off so that your neighbors can enjoy it, you can enjoy it, we all can enjoy it, the wildlife can enjoy the dark skies. So thanks to everybody for that. I'm going to make one mention for the next, it's 4 weeks from tonight on February 25th. Dr. Doug Borowski from the OSU Department of Chemistry will be coming to give a lecture on spectrometry. It is something I can normally say. It's the science of weighing atoms and molecules. It's a technical field, but it's an instrument. If you know what a mass spectrometer is, weighing an atom is a pretty amazing thing because they don't weigh very much. I love chemistry and physics. I'm really looking forward to this one. The mass spectrometer is really a fundamental tool to our understanding of how atoms, going back to like 1900, our first understanding of how atoms and subatomic structure of the universe, figured out that we have isotopes, characterizing new elements, discovering new elements, and today they're in day-to-day use as a workhorse of every well-endowed chemistry lab in the world for accelerating medical research, finding and understanding trace pollutants in the environment and a host of other things. So we'll see you 4 weeks from tonight in this room. It has been 8 weeks since our last Frontier in Science lecture, and I have to admit, I personally was disappointed to miss what I hear was a great talk by Aaron Bott of ODFW discussing sort of the social life of wolves. That was in November. December we took off so that we could have our own social lives. And as I think for many people in the room, like you, as December rolled around, I was looking forward to the sort of Norman Rockwell Christmas with hanging the ornaments and putting on, snowshoes or skis, going out into the snowy woods to harvest that perfect Christmas tree. But if you were here, and I think most of us were, what we really had was temperatures in the mid-30s and 40s, gray skies. We had a pretty constant temperature inversion, freezing fog, and steady rainy drizzle. So it's kind of weird, So it started out as what, some people are saying in kind of hushed voices might be the new normal. But humans are adaptable. I know in our house, our Christmas adaptation meant hanging out inside, doing puzzles, eating rich food, a lot of sugars, and imbibing a lot of, let's just say, heavily spiked eggnog. And so January now is dry January, and it's a Whole30 diet, and so we're turning the whole thing around. But so that was our adaptation. There might have been other ways to do it. No judgment. But anyway, of course now, as we read about fires going on in Southern California, floods in the Mid-Atlantic. This time of year, snow in New Orleans, sustained ongoing multi-year droughts across the Sun Belt. I mean, I think all of us know that climate change is indeed, the climate is indeed changing. It's a real phenomenon. Now, these changes may in fact be the new normal, or maybe that the state of change, the state of disequilibrium is in fact the new normal that we'll be familiar with. But in any case, the change is happening. And I hope that those of us in this room are able to be grateful that we have, a warm roof over our heads and the resources to take care of ourselves amid this change. And I also, I'm sure that everyone in the room, our hearts go out to those humans who around the world might need help adapting to the pace of climate change underway. But humans, aren't the only species affected by these changing climatic conditions. The ecosystems and diversity that support our species and all other species on life are what we depend on for survival really is threatened. So it is a timely thing that our speaker tonight is a person who's a distinguished researcher whose real work is gaining an understanding of how certain other species are adapting to climatic change. Tonight, the Frontiers in Science lecture series is proud to host Dr. Jamie Cornelius from the Department of Integrative Biology at OSU. She's here tonight to present a talk titled, probably up there, Amazing Adaptations, Can Birds Reduce the Stress of Climate Change? Dr. Cornelius has earned degrees in zoology at the University of Washington, a PhD in animal behavior from UC Davis. She worked as a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute of Ornithology in Germany and as a Fulbright Fellow at St. Petersburg State University in Russia. Dr. Cornelius taught at Cal State in Monterey Bay and Eastern Michigan University before returning to her roots in the Pacific Northwest and accepting an associate professor position at OSU. And today, that's where she is. She lectures, teaches, and runs the Little Bird Lab there. And I'm sure she'll be describing that. Last summer, Jamie completed a residency right here in Sisters, thanks to the Roundhouse Foundation at the Pine Meadow Ranch, where she was investigating the role of art in scientific creative thinking. Dr. Cornelius has also won awards for her presentation skills and ability to convey difficult subjects to, mere mortals. And I can see why that would be true, because I took the liberty of logging onto the Rate My Professor site. I know you know this already, but she's got 100% 5.0s out of 5.0. And I've read things like, I love this professor. Dr. Cornelius explains very difficult concepts in a way that makes them very understandable. She's really genuine and works hard to make sure you understand the material. She can be pretty funny. And I love this particularly intriguing comment. During mid-lecture breaks, she sings for the class. So no pressure, no pressure. But tonight, Dr. Cornelius will describe the work that she and her students are doing in the Cornelius Little Bird Lab. And her research has to do with the incredible adaptability of avian behavior and physiology when subjected to some of the same environmental stresses that we as humans are grappling with, including things like ice storms and wildfires and dense smoke, etc. So please welcome me in joining tonight's speaker, Dr. Jamie Cornelius.
Wow, well I can see why you are the MC. Thank you so much. We're going to see if we can get that to stop happening first. I think we spoke too soon. We're like, wow, that was easy and smooth.
Yeah.
Okay, just we're going to try this. There we go. No? There's some weirdness happening. Do this. Well, while we're fiddling with this, I will just, I want to thank David Ellis for coming to our open house at the Roundhouse Foundation, because that's why I'm here. And I'm just going to do this down just a minute. It's not flashing on my screen. Anyway, well, I want to thank the Roundhouse Foundation for inviting me to come and do a residency that's super unique like that. A chance to take, there were two artists from Portland State University who we wrote a proposal together. We've been discussing the connections and differences between art and science and how important creativity is to science and to advancing science in, important ways. I think it's interesting. Two dongles are doing the same thing. I think it's a really great, worthwhile mission. And it's a unique one, so I appreciate their investment in these concepts and things. And then I just want to thank all of you. These are my favorite talks to give because you're here because you are curious, interested people, and therefore you're very interesting people. And thank you for being an interesting person and someone who's curious about the world and who will invest time in things like the Sister Science Club. I think it is a unique thing, and it's, I think, going to be really important to kind of pushing science forward and science communication in the future, are these kind of community-organized, grassroots types of events. Okay, I don't know, where are we at here? What should I do? Okay, you know what?
You sing?
Yeah! So we normally do a halftime song and then an end of show song. We're going to do a start of show song this time. Thankfully, that's an option. But what song? Okay. Okay. The story of the Little Bird Lab. My husband is a biologist too, and he studies sharks. And he's a very, let's say, well, social media forward. He really likes kind of advertising science and being out there, in the world with his science. And so he's very good at kind of branding. And he named his lab the Big Fish Lab. And he studies big sharks. And so, of course, then I had to be the little bird louder. Which I love. But so anyway, this is a song about it's a biology love song, and I realize that's dorky, but it's okay. And it's about us being in the mountains and the ocean and kind of dealing with that. Yeah, he makes a lot of fun of me for this song because the word hypothesis is in it. I'm proud of that. Okay, we'll see. I hope you can hear me if I stand out here. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, wait, I have to play the right song now. This is better. No, it's still alright. I'm gonna get it. Okay. Just gonna go ahead and start. World can be so darn interesting to a young free soul with biology dreams. We tend to spend many months on the road, living, working in nature's abode. Well, this isn't so bad for single-lady peace, roaming the wood, free and easy. But those of us with our hearts occupied, we battle with love, pain, and desire. When I first met the man I now love so true, I didn't stop to think he's a biologist too. I jumped head first with no hypothesis about loving a man who works on the sea. He is the ocean wide and free, and I am the mountains tall and green. Somehow manage our world in between of water and stone, algae and trees. Well, I study birds in a camp where I work. He studies sharks and he bobs like a cork. Bright ones like bass and dead mammal goo, while I'm in Carhartts, white with virtue. Really, it just rhymes. Sometimes work is not too far apart. We can drive to the field and meet again by dark. But often I'm several states far away, thinking of him at the end of the day. He is the ocean deep and blue, and I am the mountain strong and true. Somehow between them we seem to make do. When he wears swim fins, I'll wear snowshoes. Well, I suppose I'd study a diving sea god, leave the high mountains, not camp in my truck. But I live, breathe for that clean mountain air, like he loves cold, salty wind in his hair. And he is the ocean and old shanty song, and I am the mountain strumming along, and always together our hearts playing too, like Emmy, Graham, Johnny, and June. Thank you. What's our story? Should I do another one? Why not? Okay.
It's kind of hard to hear.
Is it?
Yeah.
Well,
Project your back up.
Okay.
See power side.
okay.
So it's just going to be
think I'll unplug the computer while it does that. Oh. Okay. Okay. Okay, yay, it worked. Okay, well, so as I mentioned, we are the Little Bird Lab, and we study how birds respond to mostly unpredictability in the world, and just environmental change. And there's lots of different types of environmental change. You're all familiar with some of these. We have really sometimes quite striking changes in daily conditions where the sun comes up and warms everything up, and all kinds of things change with those cycles. Activity of predators and prey, and the whole world, kind of goes through these cycles on a daily basis. There are longer term fluctuations like tidal, lunar fluctuations. And then there are longer term ones that can be particularly, high in magnitude, like seasonal cycles. And being from here, you are very familiar with this type of a seasonal cycle. This picture of Grand Tetons, one of my main study sites in Wyoming. And the conditions, the temperature, the food availability are changing sometimes to really large extremes across these seasons. And the animals that are living in these places need to be able to cope with those changes. And they make a lot of adjustments in behavior and in physiology in order to be able to survive these types of change. There's lots of different strategies, but what I do is I'm what's called an ecophysiologist. It's a person who's very interested in kind of the physiology, how the body responds and coordinates responses to the environment, and how that allows for survival, and sometimes doesn't allow for survival. And as ecophysiologists, we use this acronym called MAD, which birds are good at looking mad. But so animals can do lots of different things to try to cope with this environmental change. They can move, right? So especially birds are highly mobile. And so many of them will make long distance migrations to move north or wherever it might be, and take advantage of the pulse of resources that's available in the spring and summer. And then they'll run away, right? They escape and leave and go somewhere easier in the winter. And by doing that, they really minimize the environmental change that they're exposed to. They're keeping their average more consistent by moving. But lots of animals stay, and the residents need to adapt. So you can also maybe use the word acclimate for the A. Either way, there must be something about the animal that is changing with the environmental conditions that allows it to cope with those conditions. And I'm interested in what those are and why they work most of the time and sometimes fail. Because if those two strategies don't work, you don't really want to get to the D, but you do, the death, right? That's what you're trying to avoid. And you're trying to reproduce, right? Pass on your genes to the next generation. And lest we think that birds are the only taxa with angry faces, I include this near mammal. Okay. So many animals, and there's a bird talk, so here's a bird example, have really clear seasonal phenologies where they're cycling through these very clear stages of behavior and physiology in order to cope with these environmental changes. But lots of environmental changes, so the advantage of these is that they can prepare. They can prepare for these changes. And many of them, it does take a lot of energy and time and resources to make these changes. But lots of environmental challenges that are extreme are not predictable. So this is just two examples of like a cold winter storm and a wildfire where the animals can't necessarily spend weeks preparing for something like this. This is something that just happens to them, and they need to have the ability to respond if they're going to survive. And for small endotherms like birds and small mammals, any animal really, but especially for small animals, these kinds of events can be really dangerous if food becomes limiting. And food can be limiting as, like in this ice storm, it's just all covered, right? And they just don't have access to the food. Or it can be that things like a heat dome are limiting their ability to perform. So if you're going to overheat, you need to go feed your young if they're going to grow and survive and grow up to be the next generation. You need to feed them, but if you can't because it's too hot and you would overheat and die, then you now have to shift those behaviors to some very narrow windows of time. In the morning and in the evening, it might not be enough, right? So there's different ways that food can be really limiting, and it's not just availability. It also has to do with behavior and physiology. And extinction risks of populations, usually in these cases, increases with the duration and with the magnitude of the event. So this is an example showing kind of on average temperature is elevating. Green is like this is a temperature at which these species are really well adapted. Yellow is that's getting more challenging, but it's survivable. And red is when they die, right? That's when you've reached their physiological tolerance limit and the individuals can't cope anymore. And some of the important things to think about is not just how high does it get, but how long does it stay there? And then how frequent is it? Because many animals can tolerate a really challenging condition for a short period of time, as long as there's breaks in between and they can recover. And that's true for our bodies too, during heat events, for example. It's really important that our bodies can cool down at night. And it's when they can't that we start to see a lot of health problems emerge. So these events can cause really high mortality. This is two examples, one in France where tens of thousands of seabirds washed up after this really big storm. The other picture is from the 2020 die-off of insectivores in the American Southwest. I don't know if you remember that in the news, but I'm sure you remember the 2020 fires that burned down Detroit. Those fires pushed a lot of migrant birds out of their summer territories earlier than was normal. And as I mentioned, birds prepare for migration. They need time to be in the right physiological state to support this long-distance, high-endurance exercise feat. And when they don't have that, it puts them into a state of potential stress. And maybe that would have been okay if that was the only thing that went wrong, but they were pushed out early, and then there was a cold snap in the American Southwest, and hundreds of thousands of birds died. And it was a noticeable event. People were finding them, just masses of them dead on the ground. It was a remarkable thing. But the good news is that not all individuals die. Some of them survive. So why is that? What did they do that their dead, flock mates didn't do? And that's some of the things that we're interested in the Little Bird Lab. So we're interested in defining what are the energy costs of these unpredictable events for songbirds, what are the adaptations that help them to cope with these kinds of events, and what are the kind of differential survival and reproductive success for individuals that use different strategies. If you hide during a storm instead of continue foraging, what does that look like? When is it different? But studying unpredictability, as you can imagine, is hard because by definition you can't predict an unpredictable event. So you have to be in the right place at the right time, and you have to have, ideally you'd have pre-storm, pre-event data that you're comparing to during or after the storm. So it's really hard, and this is why there's not really a lot of research on these types of events. It can be also really difficult to find and catch the animals when they're coping with these kinds of events, because they might not be out foraging. And that's, one of the ways we catch them is when they're out moving around and we intercept them somehow. So what we have done is we use a combination of both field studies but also controlled laboratory experiments to try to better understand how they are dealing with these types of challenges. And these are 5 of the contexts in which we have kind of general research programs targeting. So I'm going to tell you about a couple of them, and we'll see how much time we have. But I'm going to start with some stories about food shortages and how birds use some really interesting social information to better cope with food shortage. And then we should have time for storms, and we might have time for fire. We'll see how we're doing. Okay, so to talk about food shortage, I want to introduce this amazing bird, the red crossbill. You can see its crossed bill morphology that it's named after, and that is a specialized bill for extracting the seeds from conifer cones. So you're going to see this bird kind of scissoring the jaw open sideways, and then sticking the tongue down to get seeds out of the cone. And they're really efficient at extracting this high-fat, high-energy food resource from conifer cones. And that is, they're highly specialized on these cones. And that's a really useful, it's an advantageous thing to be really good at doing this, but it also means they're really dependent on these food supplies too, right? They're not as good at getting other kinds of food. And the thing about cones is conifers produce seed crops in really variable patterns as defenses against squirrels. So there will be one big region that produces a cone crop one year, and then it won't produce seeds for 3 or 4, right? And that kills off the squirrels in between seed crops. And it would kill off the birds as well, but birds are more mobile, and they can go and find a different cone crop somewhere else. And so they move year to year to find these new cone crops, and that they make these nomadic migrations to find them. We don't really know how they find them. I'll show you a picture in a minute. But also, if they find a seed crop, they usually find them in the summer. They can breed in the summer. If the cones retain seeds for long enough through the winter, they can breed again in the winter. They're so good at getting these seeds that even on short winter days in very cold places like here or Jackson Hole, Wyoming, they can breed in February. So that is remarkable. We're super interested in the energy cost of that. But also that seed supply can crash, mostly based on weather patterns and seed dispersal. So once the seeds fall out of the cones, they're not available. And the birds may need to make what are called eruptive migrations to escape these kind of sudden drops in food. And just to give a sense of scale, this isn't even it, right? They move across the continent to look for these seed crops, and they're these teeny tiny little songbirds. And we don't think they know, quote, where they're going. Not like a seasonal migrant that has all these programmed kind of genetic codes for, okay, I go this way this time of year, and use these cues to get there. We don't know how these nomadic migrants solve this problem, but I'm sure it is fascinating. We're working on it, and we need better technology to do it. We're almost there with GPS technology for a bird this small, but not quite. We're about at a robin size. We need a little smaller. So these eruptive migrations are emergency responses. Any mobile species can do this theoretically, but it's really evident in particularly boreal species that live in these conifer forest dominated habitats that have these huge fluctuations in the food supply because of the conifer trees. So you see a lot in boreal species. But also I like to remind people that this is not just a bird problem, as Ron said in his eloquent introduction. This is a human problem too, and it's going to be worse, right? We're seeing more climate disasters, and people, they're not safe, right? They need to go somewhere, and you can imagine the emotional challenge of this kind of a decision. Think about what it would take for you to leave your home for something that's unknown somewhere else, and potentially in a place where you're not welcome and maybe even villainized. It's awful. And it's a really hard situation for birds and humans alike. So why are these risky? Well, they're risky because the timing is unpredictable and they might not have time to prepare. As I mentioned, that's important for small animals with high metabolic rates. You can't just like fly 500 miles on a whim, right? You need to lay down fat stores, build your muscle, and prepare for that kind of a task. They also might have to eat weird things when they're moving through habitat that's not their habitat while they're searching for a better place. So I'm really interested in how do they make that decision? That is a hard decision. You know what it's like where you are. You know what the predators are like, you know where to get things. And if you're gonna go off on this unknown venture to find something maybe better somewhere else, that's a big decision. So to talk about this, talk about the stress physiology. And stress is a loaded word for us humans. But in this context, in the context of food, stress occurs when energy requirements exceed your energy intake. So you're in kind of a negative energy balance. You're relying on internal energy stores like fat or muscle to get you through. And when that happens, the brain detects that energy imbalance and initiates a hormone cascade that one of which the endpoints is the release of corticosterone. In humans, it's cortisol. They're very similar. It's highly conserved across vertebrates. And this hormone coordinates whole body responses to a stressor. So it's going to promote kind of burning of energy substrates to make sure there's lots of good energy in the blood for all of the cells that are going to help you to cope. Could be muscle, could be your brain, could be your eyes. Whatever you need to deal with the stressor, you need energy for those cells. And so that's one of the goals of that hormone or instructions. Another is that it actually changes behavior and promotes, it kind of suppresses investment in reproduction, and it promotes investment in survival. That makes sense, especially for a long-lived animal. Find food, escape, right? Look, do something. So back in graduate school, many years ago, I did a captive experiment with crossbills because I wanted to know what happens when there's a sudden food reduction to their hormone levels and to their behavior. And so this was a very simple experiment in which I had well-fed birds and then food-restricted birds. They had 75% of what they normally eat for a few days, and indeed, this initiates this stress hormone response. It also increased their activity levels, so we could interpret that as at least searching behavior and maybe escape behavior. But one of the things that I was thinking about when I started this experiment, this was one of my moneymaker ideas that honestly propelled my career, was this fact. This is how you find them in the wild. You don't find a single bird deciding to erupt and go look for something different. They move in social groups. So I was really interested in whether or not social information might influence their response to food restriction. So what I did is in these pairings, I had some food-restricted birds that had a neighbor who was well-fed or a neighbor who was also food-restricted. And when I did that, I found that, in fact, if you have a neighbor who is also food-restricted, you have a much larger stress response to the same physiological stress. They all had the same food restriction. But if your neighbor also was food-restricted, you responded more. And when we did follow-up experiments and actually looked at what was happening in the brain that controls all of these things, we found that there was a very strong effect of social information on receptor expression for these hormones in regions of the brain that are critical for controlling the stress response itself. It was actually reducing receptor expression. And what that means is that it was sensitizing the brain's stress response. So it was making the brain more responsive to stress and a longer lasting stress response. And we could think, that sounds horrible. Why would you want that to happen? But I would love for you to think of stress responses, even in yourselves, as adaptive. These are good things. Even though they make you maybe feel a little edgy, they are helping your body to prepare and meet some challenge in your life that's hard. And it's getting you ready for those things. So I like to tell my students, when you're feeling stressed out about an exam, That's a good thing. It's going to make you study harder, prepare more, and perform better. You know, like lean into it. It's okay. So I asked this question: if the stress response is adaptive, if it's a good thing that they're becoming more reactive to stress, then that suggests that if they have this social information kind of before a food restriction, there's some predictive value to the social information, then they should be able to cope better with a food restriction. There should be some value to it. So that was the next experiment I did at OSU, actually, was I gave social information that was either before the bird had a food restriction, so we called that predictive social information. So kind of a warning from their neighbor, uh-oh, you know, food's getting bad. And then we had information that was just simultaneous. So at the same time they received a food restriction, their neighbor did too. That was like the prior experiment. I really wanted to test this predictive value. And so what we found is that crossbills that received social information from hungry neighbors prior to their food restriction, which is in the blue bars, lost less mass than those that had it at the same time. So this is just showing the change in mass. So the further down the bars go, the more mass they lost during their restriction. And the birds that had that predictive social warning from the neighbors were better at it, that they lost less mass during their food restriction, suggesting that there is a real value to these social cues. We also found that the bird, so it wasn't that, so when you have a neighbor who's agitated maybe and not being fed, one of my predictions was, well, then maybe they'll eat more when we limit their food. So the way we did this food limitation was just gave them a limited amount of time to feed. And I wanted to do it that way so that they had a chance to improve. Right? So they could, at first they don't know, they don't eat enough, and they lose mass. But then as they learn, oh, I only have food available a little bit during the day, they eat more and they actually can gain some mass back. And I wanted to see if they were better at that task with this social cues. But they actually ate like an identical amount of food. and they didn't really have differ in activity, but yet they saved almost half of the mass loss that the other birds did. This is one of those moments where I was actually contemplating this in real time, like laying in bed, thinking about like, how can that happen? How can you eat the same, move the same, but lose half the mass? And because I'm a migratory biologist, I know about these cycles of intestinal growth and regression during migratory flights in birds, and that the birds really need to grow their intestines in order to gain mass because they get more food, more energy out of their food when they eat it. And so I decided I took a small subset of these birds and I looked at intestinal size. And the birds with the social information had larger intestines. So there was something about the social information that was preparing the birds through communication with the gut and keeping it really good at assimilating energy even when food consumption went down. Okay, so great, this was a very cool finding. Again, this was, I call it my moneymaker study because it's an interesting one. But these are crossbills. They're weird. They're nomads. They're highly social. And so I was curious, does this happen in other species? So I looked at this in two close relatives. The house finch, which I actually thought might not use social cues because their food's fairly, much more predictable, and pine siskins. And both of them used social cues. House finches, perhaps even more so than crossbills. So this seems to be a broad thing. But social information can be dangerous if it's wrong. And this is an example from everybody's favorite year, 2019 to 2020, when lots of things about COVID were going around and people were trusting that information. And the National Poison Data System had nearly 4 times the normal case of ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine exposures because people trusted this social information. They got it from a source that they believed in, for better or worse. So it can be dangerous to use social information from other individuals. It could be wrong, right? And you've now changed your gut physiology because of it. that has implications and consequences. So another really interesting thing about crossbills is there are these different ecomorphs that have different size bills. And those different size bills make them more or less efficient at extracting seeds from particular conifer species. So there's this theory out there that this is, can you see my cursor? Yeah. So this is bill depth, and this is the groove width inside. That's what they husk these seeds with. And you can see that there's these peaks across different sizes. And these peaks are actually the size of the bill of the type of crossbill it's about. This is the littlest type 3. They're very common on the coast. They eat a lot of western hemlock. They can absolutely be here eating ponderosa though too. They eat a lot of things, but they're best at a certain subset of cones. And you can see that these peaks are in different places for each of the types. So we developed a hypothesis that perhaps if we're interested in type 2s, which is what you have that are about to breed here in the winter, they're saying like crazy. Go out to Camp Sherman, you'll hear them and see them. These type 2s should perhaps weight information from type 5s, which have a very similar bill morphology to them, and therefore the information should be more relevant to them than information from, say, the type 3, which is the furthest difference in bill morphology. If they're, kind of being choosy about social media, if there's a cost to using these social cues. And I should just say, too, that all these types, they know each other. They overlap in range. They hang out in mixed species flocks all the time. I can catch a type 3 with a type 2 decoy, no problem. They like each other. They respond to each other. But I wanted to know, do these social cues work in different types? So we predicted that they would respond most to type 5s and less to type 3s and even less to pine siskins, which are more generalist in their diet, but they can eat conifer seeds too. So first of all, because of just logistics of catching these birds in the field and running these experiments, I had to do some of them in the winter and some in the summer. And of course, there's a seasonal difference, which is annoying for experiments like this, but also interesting. So this is the mass loss in the type 2, so those birds were asking, do you listen? In summer versus winter on the same food restriction. And you can already see that they lose a lot. They're a lot better at this in the winter than they are in the summer. That makes sense. Winter is when food could be most limiting and most unpredictable. And so these are all captive birds. They have plenty of food. They're all on the same warm temperature, but they're on different day lengths. So they have that cue about seasonality, and it's clearly doing something to their bodies that makes them better at this in winter. So that was one interesting thing. The other thing we found is that when you give other type 2 social information, so the same type, it has a protective effect in both seasons. So both seasons we still see that the birds with the predictive warning do better. But they didn't respond at all to the social information from any of the other types, whether or not it was a closely overlap foraging efficiency type or a distant one or a pine siskin. In all of those cases, it didn't have a protective effect. So the type 2s are not listening to that information in the same way as they are to their own type. Suggesting there's a cost to listening to that information if it's not really good, really good information. So we saw that these social cues are probably an adaptation for unpredictable food, where it's priming the brain to respond more strongly to food stress. It's protecting the ability in the gut to assimilate nutrients, and it's allowing for better outcomes. Not only did they conserve mass better, but they also they lost similar amounts of fat, but they better preserved their flight muscle mass when under these food restrictions. And that's the muscle you need if you're going to try to go somewhere else and find something better. And so overall, we think this was really improving their outcomes. Okay, so this is when I normally do a song. Do you want a song? Because I'm going to do a crossbill song. And I guess I can try and sing into this mic. It might be a little odd. It's going to be voice heavy, but that's good. Okay, so this was a song I actually wrote in the last year of my PhD research. I was pretty tired of being in the field. I spent a lot of time alone in the field. So it's kind of like a field blues, but don't worry, I love field work. It's just, there's moments that are hard. And so the only other thing you probably need to know about the song is that Batman is a dog, the most amazing dog ever. He's long since left this world, but he was my field buddy. And then June is a decoy, a live decoy. So I have kind of pet brought. They're not pets; they're research birds. But I had a decoy named June who grew up with me, and I had her for 7 years, and she went everywhere with me. And Batman. Okay. Let's see if I can play the right tune this time. Well, they're small and red, and their beaks are bent. They wander around the country 'cause the cones are spent. And all I can do is follow them, try and remember how it was back then when I had a home. Well, it cost me a partner and a pickup truck. Spent weeks in the rain down on my luck. Lord knows why I kept following them. I got even worse when my dog joined in. I no longer was alone. I tell you, I wanna go home, live a normal life again. It's been fun, but it's time to end. Been around the earth and back again. I wanna go home. Well, I know the coast like the back of my hand. Surfed the sea and lived on the land. Sang at night to Batman and June. Made a few friends on the road too. Somehow it's not enough, but the love of my life's waiting patiently as I catch the last birds for a PhD. Heading down south to be with him. Try and live in one place again. Make ourselves a home. I tell you, I wanna go home, live a normal life again. It's been fun, but it's time to end. Been around the earth and back again. Love crossbirds, but they're shitty friends, and I wanna go home. I ever wrote. Well, I learned how to play guitar because I was in the field alone all the time. I was like, nobody had to listen to me, so I felt okay trying. I really liked it. Okay, are you ready for story 2? Okay, so we're going to talk about storms. So animals, including us, lose heat to a cold environment. Endotherms do. Well, all animals do, whether or not you make heat or not. And that can happen through lots of different ways, just breathing and talking. You lose heat through evaporation, touching cold things, and conductive heat loss. And then thermal radiation, which is accelerated with convective air movement, is a particularly brutal form of heat loss in the winter. And endothermy, animals that generate heat and try to maintain their body temperature, is a really challenging winter strategy. And that's because all the proteins in our bodies are adapted to operate in a really narrow range of temperatures. And if our body temperature gets outside of that narrow range, it has catastrophic implications and consequences for our performance. So you've all tried to use your hands for a tiny task in the cold weather, and it's amazing how quickly you lose the ability to hold a pencil when you're really cold. And that's because our proteins are so well adapted to particular temperature. And so our bodies and other endotherms burn energy stores to produce heat and counteract that heat loss to maintain a temperature at which we have high performance. And this requires that either we're eating a lot of food and turning energy over at a high rate, or storing a lot of energy and using that stored energy when things get cold. And hypothermia, of course, starts to occur if your heat loss exceeds your heat production. So in birds, they have very thin skin. You can blow the feathers apart and see how much fat is stored on a bird. So in the morning, right now, if you were to go outside and catch a bird in the morning, their muscle would look like this. It'd be dark purple, that's the muscle, and there's a little bit of fat up here. By nighttime, they'll look more like this, where they have stored a whole bunch of lipid, and they're going to use that overnight to survive. A lot of these small birds are living on that kind of a razor's edge, right? Razor thin edge. They don't eat one day, they might not make it one night. This is why these freezing rainstorms are so catastrophic for them. But there's lots of things in here that birds can change about their strategy and their physiology. They can change how much food they're eating, they can change how much fat they're storing, and they can change how much heat production they can make. So thermogenic capacity is how much heat can you make when your muscle shivers. And they can build larger muscles that produce more heat in the cold winter. And then there's a lot of physiology that goes into that, changes in protein expression and whatnot, that helps them to do that. But they can do that. They can change investment. But it's expensive. Maintaining a bigger muscle that can create heat is more expensive. Now you have to eat more food to just keep the muscle going, as well as produce the heat. Birds, of course, also can minimize heat loss with insulation. So they carry their puffy coats, and they can either wear a skinny puffy coat by keeping their feathers tight, or they can puff it out like this little tit, who is obviously very cold. Hopefully is going to make it. But they do that to change the depth of the insulative air layer that prevents heat movement, or it minimizes heat exchange from the warm body to the cold air by increasing that buffer. The problem is that bird feathers are also their raincoats, and heavy rain can require behavior called slicking, where they lay their feathers down really tight, and it sheds the water really well, which is critically important because if water gets underneath those outer exterior protective feathers and wets the down underneath, they're goners. They have no insulation left, and they're not going to make it. So this minimizes the chances of that, but it also minimizes the boundary layer, and so they've lost their puffy coat, right? They've lost their insulative boundary layer. And as Ron alluded to, under climate change, we've already seen changes in how often we have cold days, so the days below freezing, below 32 degrees, has already declined across the United States. So the lighter the color, the fewer the days below 32, and the predictions are to have quite warm, much warmer winters. And this may be much closer in our future than we've predicted before. Seem to be beating our worst case models, which is not great news. And with this warming of winters, we're also seeing a drop off in snow. And some of the alarming numbers are in 30 years there will not be snow in the Cascades. That's alarming to me anyway. I think it should be to all of us. And what that means is that we have less snowpack. That has implications. But one of the reasons this could be happening is, well, maybe there's just less winter precipitation. But that's not the case. We're actually anticipating much more winter precipitation at the same time that we have lower summer precipitation. So warmer, wetter winters and warmer, drier summers. And these warm, wet winters mean, on average, more cold rain, less cold snow. And if you have been outside in cold rain, cold snow, you know what's worse. What gets you really wet and is really challenging for producing heat is water. So one of our current NSF-funded projects is describing the real-time metabolic costs of storms for birds and determining how they change their investments in these different types of coping mechanisms to survive those storms. And then in behavior as well. And to do this, we're doing field studies. So it's hard to measure energy in free-living animals, but Jim Cochran, this guy who makes these amazing radio transmitters out of his garage in Illinois, has figured out how to create these little VHF radio transmitters that weigh 0.5 gram. And they have electrodes that are that slide under the skin of the bird, which is quite easy to do on songbird because of that thin, kind of non-vascularized skin. And we now have, and then every time the heart produces a potential, which is energy flow, it alters the output of the radio in a way that we can record with an MP3 recorder and then filter later and count the heartbeats. So we now have a real-time estimate, it's an estimate, of energy costs of a bird that's out there doing its thing, right? It's reproducing, it's living through storms, whatever it's doing, it's foraging, and we can measure the real-time kind of fluctuating energy costs of the birds while they do it. So I've been working on this project for what feels like an alarmingly long time now, like 15 years, on and off, in Grand Teton National Park. And this offers, so we're comparing summer and winter, breeding, non-breeding in both seasons. And there's really different challenges in those seasons. In the summer, you can't walk across the river, so that's a problem. This is Taylor, everybody's favorite shark biologist, at least mine, swimming our gear across the snake. The bird just zipped right over, and we were like, ugh. I actually stayed on the other side of the river because I was like, that bird's coming back, and 10 minutes later, it came back. Anyway, so we're interested in their energy costs. Well, there's a lot of things that can contribute to energy costs. You can have a lot of expense just keeping your tissues alive. That's kind of, it's called BMR, basal metabolic rate. It's the cost of just having a body that's alive and working. And then you add on lots of other costs, like maybe sickness or disease, so parasite burden. And we take blood smears so that we can look at white blood cell counts and get an idea if they're mounting an immune response or not. We can look at the bird when we catch it. This is a female that has a brood patch, so she's lost her feathers, and she sits on kind of a fluid-filled, her skin right there to warm eggs and improve their growth rates so that they can fledge and get them out before they're eaten by a squirrel or something else. So we can know if they're breeding or not. We have weather stations very nearby for weather data and temperature data to look at thermoregulation, and then activity levels. So we follow them, and because they're foraging on seeds so high up in the trees, when we find them and watch them with a scope or binoculars, we can actually see them spitting the seed holes out as they eat the seeds. So we can get an estimate of their foraging efficiency, which is super hard to do in most birds. But because of their specialization, we can measure that. And so we'll measure how many seeds per minute they can get out of hundreds of pounds. And then we are wearing GPS units when we follow the birds, and so we track ourselves and determine the bird's kind of home range size. And then the other cool thing about these radios is they emit a continuous tone, so it's awful to listen to for hours, for days. It's just you can hear the heartbeat kind of modulating the tone, but then anytime the bird moves, the change in the antenna position relative to our antenna, you can hear it. So it moves and you get a little wobble in the signal. And so now even if we don't see the bird, we can know if they're resting and still, if they're kind of foraging and just moving around a branch, and flight is super distinct because it's a very sinusoidal, sound. And in fact, your stomach drops when you hear it because you're like, okay, gotta go, and you're off after the bird. So I'll just show you some of the thermoregulatory data that relates to rain, I think. So this is from 38 birds that we followed for multiple days in Jackson. And the red ones are summer. And you can see that, as you might expect, warmer temperatures, lower heart rates. And as temperature drops, the heart rate is going up to meet that thermoregulatory cost. But then there's a really interesting thing that happens in the winter where the higher cost is actually the warmer temperatures. And it peaks, and you can see these really high values right above freezing. And if I just show you some anecdotes of awful storms that I was tracking in, this is one day it was -5 Celsius, so just below freezing. It was a snowstorm, and it snowed 6 or 8 inches that day. And then the next day, so here's the nighttime heart rate drops, and then the next day it warmed up. This should be easier for the bird, except for that it was warmed up enough that it rained. And the heart rate, so first of all, bird heart rates 500 beats per minute on average. They spiked to 1,200 beats per minute for sustained periods of time. This is a hummingbird heart rate. And no doubt this was an incredibly challenging event for these birds. How are we doing on time? Are you okay? Okay. Okay, so I just want to tell you about this captive experiment we did where we wanted to know, so if you put birds in cold, they will get better at producing heat. This metric, this metabolic metric called summit metabolic rate, is a metric of how much heat can they produce. And we give them a cold challenge, so we make them really cold, and we measure how much heat can you make? How good are you at this? And if you acclimate birds to cold conditions, winter birds, they're much better at this. And this is well described, but we were wondering if rain does the same thing. So we had a big captive experiment where we had warm, dry conditions, warm, rainy conditions, cold, dry, and cold, rainy. And yes, that means we had to build a rain system to rain on birds in the building. And we did that by just making these little drip pans that actually produced a remarkably rain-like sensation. We tried vegetable sprayers, that was awful. It was like a mist just like in your face. But the drippy rain worked really well. And so these are 2 grad students we did this for 4 months through the winter where we rained. They had a half an hour of rain a day and they got 2 days off a week. So it wasn't like a ton of rain, right? But it was consistent, exposure to a rainy environment. And what we found is that, so here's this measure of heat capacity. The cold birds are blue. And so first of all, if you were in the cold, you were better at heat production. That's great because that agrees with all the other experiments that have ever been done. But also in both the warm and the cold conditions, birds held in the rainy conditions invested more and were better able to produce heat during a cold challenge. So this suggests there's this cost to being in a rainy environment. The other really cool thing is that birds in the rain maintained this investment in heat production for longer into the year. So you can see months here, November, January, February, that we were doing this experiment over. The temperature isn't changing for these birds, either cold or warm, the whole time. But photoperiod's changing, again, the seasonal cue. And what we found is that from November to January, all of the groups showed kind of a subtle but statistically significant increase in their heat production. So they were, we think, kind of preparing for the winter, even though their conditions were pretty stable. But then in January to February, the birds held in dry conditions, both these warm ones and these cold ones, the solid lines or the dry, showed a disinvestment in heat production. And remember, these cold birds are still in the cold, okay? But the day length is increasing. If you look at the average temperature in Oregon, here's February, and we're coming into this big kind of spring increase in temperature. So what we think is happening is they're predicting that. And they're disinvesting in that, getting ready to breed. February is a common breeding season for crossbills, but the rain prevented them from doing that. They stayed invested in thermogenic capacity. So the rain is causing birds to invest more and for longer in heat production, and that should be expensive, and if you look at food intake, it is. So again, cold in the blue, and then the dashed line is the rain. In both conditions, they ate a lot more when they were housed in this 30-minute rain a day condition. So cold and rain exposure induced them to invest more and suggest that there really is a cost to this potential for increasing winter rain. So we're going back on Friday to Jackson, Wyoming, and we're gonna be there for a month, trying to get more data during storms in these crossbills. And our ultimate goal is to really help inform models better about predicting overwinter survival of temperate songbirds under climate change. Like, how are ranges going to shift if we take rain into account? No models do. They're all about temperature. So we're really interested in that. And I was going to tell you some smoke stuff, but you'll maybe ask me about it. Here. I could probably do it fairly quick, but some of you are probably dying to go.
You dying to go?
No.
Let's talk about smoke and
Okay,
then save
sorry those of you who are dying to go, you're not as vocal. Or maybe not willing to be rude. Okay, I'll go fast. So, okay, fire, this is what we're interested in. Wildfire produces these giant footprints of smoke, and very little is known about the physiological, behavioral costs of smoke in wild animals. Like, alarmingly little research has been done on this. It's really surprising, actually. So we have a collaborative study going with Morgan Tingley, who's at UCLA, and Meg Krawczyk is at OSU. She's a forest ecologist, and other people on our team. And this was funded by a National Geographic Society Explorer grant, where we, and by we I mean mostly me, chased smoke over the summer. I've done this for 2 summers now, including a lot around here. Because when I started to just look at my data and what I already had, because there were times when I was in places that were smoky, we found this, where this is juvenile body condition, so that's the black dots is the body condition, and the blue kind of clouds represent smoke conditions, so poor, high particulate matter in the atmosphere. And what we saw is that here's kind of a normal year, or a low smoke year, I guess, and the body condition's pretty high, but then here's the body condition was a little bit lower, kind of a week or 2 after a smoke event, and then during a smoke event it was even lower, suggesting that maybe, I mean this is preliminary data, but maybe there's an impact on their ability to feed that's causing them to rely on their stored energy and is dropping their body condition. And so this was some of the money that went, or the data that went into the grant application for National Geographic. And they gave us some money to try to learn more. And so I went out to smoke events and caught birds at water holes in the East Cascades. A lot of these data come from, Cabin Lake, if anybody's been there. It's a place where Audubon Society members maintain some water guzzlers for wildlife, and the birds come there like crazy. As well as a lot of places around here, around Sisters. And these are the 2 species I got the most data from. Cass and finches, which are they're related to a crossbill. They're seed-eating largely, but they can eat other stuff too. And then Audubon's warblers, which are yellow-rumped warbler, that are also diet generalists but eat a lot of insects. So we're looking at kind of blood physiology metrics in this graph, and what you can see is blood sugar levels in green air, so this is just like our human AQI index, green air conditions compared to red. I didn't get any purple events, unfortunately. But you can see that there's this significant decline in blood sugar levels during these smoke events, suggesting that at least probably what's happening is their food intake patterns are changing, and that they're eating less food. We also measure these ketones, which are it's another energy source that the brain can use, neurons can use, and they typically elevate if blood glucose levels drop to dangerously low levels, and we didn't see an increase in ketones. So I don't think they were pushed, in red air at least, they weren't pushed so far that it was a big challenge. But we still need to we're going to look at stress hormones. I've got an undergraduate student who's doing those measurements in the lab right now, this week, so we'll see. But the other interesting thing is that in the seed eater, there was no change in muscle size. So this is the pectoralis muscle, and from green, yellow, orange, and red air conditions. But in the warbler, they significantly dropped from green to red. And if you're not used to reading these types of box plots, they're showing kind of the full spread of the data. So these changes are pretty large, actually. What I think this is telling us is that it matters a lot what your life history is, like kind of how you're impacted by the smoke. So if you're an insectivore and insects change their behavior and sit more in smoke events, then you are kind of doubly hosed. You have both the exposure of the smoke that's hurting your own lungs and your own, kind of normal like health metrics, but you also now have a harder time finding your food. So that's one of the directions that we're kind of hoping to go towards in the future, is looking at these life history traits in more species and seeing if this pattern holds across those directions. Okay, that's it. So we do drought research, we do predator research, cats mostly, and I'll just end by thanking the many people and funding agencies and land stewards and people like you who are interested in science and supportive of all these kinds of efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cornelius. I think the results are fascinating. It's also incredible to get a sense of the methodologies of how you're doing things in the lab and in the field, and how a skilled presenter responds and adapts to a stressful situation. If we have you back, maybe you can do magic tricks. But in the meantime, how about a few questions? Maybe 5 or 6 questions, and then we'll go from there.
Have you looked at, the impact of air, fire or smoke on the actual lungs and air sacs?
Yes and no. So yes, in the sense that we have a collaborator at Washington State University who happen to have birds and outdoor aviaries, that we were able to, collect and look at that. And there are lots of things that the vets who did those histology and looked at those tissues are finding. What's unclear is how much of that is related to captivity and how much is related to the smoke. There's some things that are obvious and some things are like, why that? There's some weird things. So we're still working through that. There's also one of our collaborators is at UC Riverside, where they have a human health program looking at pollution in rats and mice, of course, the human health models, because we're so like rats and mice. That's what we think anyway. And they're doing they're able to do really careful dosing experiments where you can deliver like really known kind of amounts of particulate and whatnot. And we don't know yet what that looks like in lungs, but we know that they did not change their behavior. But one of the really interesting things about that experiment is that they had to filter the smoke heavily to get rid of carbon monoxide, because you don't want to kill the birds, right? We just want to know what the impact of particulate is. What that means is that it smells like smoke, but it looks completely clear. So we don't know if they didn't change their behavior because they didn't actually perceive it as smoke or not. So it's actually potentially really interesting, because I think they're going to change their behavior in smoke.
Well, supposedly it's a one-way trip in a bird's anatomy.
Yep, one-way airflow.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so whatever particulates go in and are not getting breathed out. And
Yeah.
I just think that would impair their oxygenation levels.
Yeah, so birds have one-way airflow, which is what makes them able to like fly over the Himalayas while we're like sucking supplemental oxygen and crawling. They're good at that. And they have very thin exchange membranes, which makes them even more susceptible to like immune responses to the particulate, which is I think what we're going to start seeing. But they do also still have all the same protective kind of cilia and sticky mucus that traps a lot of particulate before it gets to the lung. So there's interesting kind of similarities and differences, and hopefully we'll get a grant to be able to look at those things. But we're still, right now we're not going to get one because nobody's going to get one. Hopefully that changes. Yeah.
what can we do to help birds? Should we all have backyard bird feeders?
Oh, the feeder question. Okay, feeders. Yeah. Oh, sorry. The question is, what can we help? How can we help birds? Should we all have feeders? Feeders are good and bad. I'll just say that. They're really important. They can be really important sources of food during these really challenging events, but they also, we know, spread disease. So the best thing is to plant bird food in your yard, right? Like good plants that provide food for birds. That's the healthiest thing for them. But I mean, I think I feed birds. I was talking to David Ellis, he washes his feeder every time he fills it. And that's one way you can reduce the negative consequences of feeders. And it doesn't take much, right? A quick dip in bleach, and let it dry, fill back up. And now you reduce that disease transmission part. But it can be really bad if you hear about things circulating. Sometimes you hear about these E. coli, not E. coli. Salmonella, thank you, jeez. Salmonella, coccidia, these are things that hit birds really hard. And if you hear about that, if you see a sick bird at your feeder, take it down. Don't let the other birds eat. If you can notice a sick bird, if it's puffed up and it's not moving when you approach it, that's not normal. And you should just take your feeder down for a while and reduce the chances of the transmission.
And treat your windows.
And yeah, and a lot of birds fly into windows. So one of the things that I do is if I know usually it's like a problem window, right? When most of them are fine, but there's a problem window that they tend to hit, and you just don't watch that one. I have some very dirty windows, and it's on purpose. Particular windows. You can use sticker, things. The problem with the stickers is they need to be pretty dense, because the birds will try to go right through them. But there's also films now you can get and put on windows, so just pull your shades down when you're not using the window. All these things help. Yeah.
How do birds communicate to their neighbor that they're not getting as much food?
Yeah, good question. We think it is both vocal cues and visual cues. So birds are very acoustic. And so they call a lot, they talk a lot. They have words, they have, context-specific words. Ground predator, aerial predator, really interesting modes of communication that are similar to us. And they increase their calling when they're food restricted in this way. So we think there's at least something about the frequency of the calls, but there's probably also information coded in the amplitude and the frequency modulation of the call that is communicating this stress to each other. But we know it's better when they can also see the other bird. So it seems to be a combined visual and acoustic cue that they're processing.
Perhaps
Or we
if
can let you
others
go.
have specific questions for Jamie, maybe you can hang around, but how about one last big round? Safe home, everybody. And if you could grab a chair and feel like folding it up, that's all.